something that at least wears its position on its sleeve, so that it's not pretending to be that's not offering a kind of objectivity in it. You know what I'm saying? You follow?
Yeah. No, I totally understand, and I grew up with Chomsky and others. I grew up thinking that the model of the press in countries like France looked better than the model in the US. In France, you have Libération, the leftist paper. You have Figaro, the rightist paper. You have Le Monde, the liberal intellectual paper. I thought that was a very good model. I don't think that anymore. After what has happened with Fox News, and I think part of it is the kind of hegemonic process of the news when the news enters into the cultural realm. This would be the fact that the news is employing sensationalism, is employing all kinds of things that are attractive in a cultural way, and becoming more entertainment. So I think the problem is more news as entertainment than it is news as overtly political. Yeah. Because one of the things that happens is that news starts getting far away from the truth in order to be entertaining. So you have Trump is the best example of that. He lies many times every day. He lies to the news media, but he's saying that to be entertaining. And so I think that's the danger more than having a political point of view. The danger is news as entertainment.
Okay, and do you think that there's a very distinct line to draw between what used to be called yellow journalism, maybe as the same kind of shibboleth or epithet that we look at fake news today?
Oh, yeah. I mean, this is like William Randolph Hearst, who, not like Citizen Kane, but Hearst in the early days. Hearst started wars. The Spanish-American War was begun by the Hearst newspapers sensationalizing the bombing of a U.S. ship in the Caribbean.
Okay, so good, we have some questions. I guess if you want to ask questions, maybe you could come up here and I'll pass you the mic.
Jizaba, my name, is this on? Yeah. Hello? Test. Steve Rosenbaum, University of California, Berkeley. I am just very impressed with this panel and this event. And I was saying to Paul during the break, I wish the number of people there last evening were here today. I know it was hard to get into this place. It's a wonderful space. I have many questions, but I'll just ask one or two and let others speak. My first is to Adam Thida. I am just in awe of what you have done in your life, what you went through and coming back. And I just think it's awesome, okay? So I want to thank you for that and for your very pithy and candid remarks today, which again, more people should be hearing in English, en français, en espagnol, and Myanmar. It's such a limited group because you are saying things that we're all walking around every day. I mean, I understand the ambassador has to be a diplomat. He didn't touch on obvious themes of the Reuters journalists of the 11 media. You did, and you called out. There's a press council, but who names it? Who can give it a complaint? I liked your point. It doesn't say you have to give them a complaint, but you may give them a complaint. This is the veneer of democracy. And it's not just Myanmar. It's a very sophisticated strategy around the world. The fact that this conference is happening is okay because it's largely attended by Anglophones and Francophone, so it's okay. And you point out about the press is there, but and it's a very literate population, but what are they reading? What are they reading? So I'm sorry, so let me get to my question. What is the answer, and all of you can answer this maybe, what does one do when there's a defensiveness here and other countries, the West hates us, we don't care what the UN says, take care of your own country, why are you criticizing us? And I find it hard to say, look, I'm critical of my own government and our bleepy bleep in the White House, okay? I can criticize my government, and I have a duty to, but I also, you know, it's not just me complaining here, there's international bodies. So what is the answer to moving to a, let's just say in the journalism question alone, to an independent judiciary, or to maybe a state counselor who will issue a pardon when her hands may be tied in other ways? What's the answer to kind of move things forward?
Thank you.
Well, thank you, first of all. And it's pretty broadly, that's why I chose these indicators. And when I even try to mention about the judiciary systems because of this kind of lack of these structure and process. Judiciary system itself is becoming pretty much not independent in terms of the no discriminations or violence. Even at some code, there was obviously the behavior of the attendants showing discrimination, violence, and such things. And it's allowed, even at our code. That's why I think the real approach is maybe we also need to count the sense of belonging. Sometimes the identity politics has been pretty much overwhelmed all over the world. So it's really impact. That's why I think the grant to the, for example, like linguistic rights, that's why I mentioned about when we talk about the numbers of the media has been increased, but only in Burmese, is almost not impossible to practice the real freedom of expression. That's why I think we need to think more on that, the sense of belonging and the kind of the individual and the group linguistic rights on one hand, and on the other hand, we need to go through altogether, I think, 4 steps. The one is the constitutional or the international instruments level, and another level is the legal, the legislative level, all the fundamental laws which blocking the freedom of expression should be reviewed, repeated, and amended. And another level is institutional level. That's why I mentioned about the number of institutions which protect and promote the freedom of expression. The institutional should also be very independent and very professional. That's why I give the example of the press council too. Press council cannot be the independent ombudsman. It is not yet the professional. That's why the institutional level. And at the end, it's the individual level. So when we talk about the linguistic rights, it's more like the individual level. And as a whole, the awareness and education, it's from the individual level to the states level. That's why I think it's pretty much complicated. I really don't know how to correct it, but we need to identify what are the problems, and then we approach through the problems. That's fine.
Great, thank you. Questions? Let's see. No? Anyone? What? Come forward.
Thank you for those incredible presentations. I'm a researcher from the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, at the University of London. My name's Emma Crew, and I'm really interested to be here for two reasons. One, I just wanted to let people know that we give grants to people who are looking at the relationship between politicians and anyone else in society. In Myanmar, we work with PEN Myanmar. We're big fans of PEN Myanmar. And so if anybody's interested in those grants, then they can go to our website, which is parliamentsforpeople.com. So I'd love to ask anybody who's interested in answering a question about the relationship between politicians and the media, because my own research at the moment is about corruption in the UK. And one of my findings is that people homogenize these two groups, and they tend, depending on where they're sitting, to either treat the journalists or the politicians as the heroes and the other side as the villains. Whereas I find actually, you've got champions in both groups who sometimes manage to make alliances with each other. But actually, your talk reminded me that we have to be discerning about the quality of journalism. It might be going downwards in the UK and the US, but there are still some journalists who really have a committed search for truth in their agenda. So how can we kind of support the alliances between all of us who are really truth seekers? And maybe punish the other guys.
There are probably the best kind of thing to look at are journalist organizations that really try to highlight the role of journalists as a moral force in society. So you have things like PEN, you have the Center for Investigative Reporting. In the United States, there are maybe a dozen organizations of journalists that give awards, the George Polk Award, that are interested in journalists who are really seeking the truth and trying to portray that. Now, if you look at one of my early slides, I was talking about how journalists are portrayed in the media in the kind of films we're showing this week, where journalists provide context. They really try to understand all the different pieces that are influencing something like a piece of legislation or a political issue, things like that. I don't think you will ever see a politician who is as pure as a journalist. I mean, when we teach, this I think is for the students here, when we teach journalism in school, I was trained as a journalist actually a long time ago in the 1960s and 70s. We're taught to be a moral force in society. We're taught to try to expose corruption. We're taught those things. And journalists can always think back to the time when they went to school and what they were taught. With politicians, they're taught, if you don't win an election, you can't do anything. So everything is around winning an election, so their rhetoric becomes often very untruthful, often decontextualizes situations, just talks about, in the United States, we have, not this last election, but the previous election that elected Trump, people were running on lowering taxes and not talking about how lower taxes mean lower benefits for people. So things are taken out of context. So I think that's probably the main forces for good are these journalistic organizations and journalism schools. You're never going to see that on the side of politicians, I think.
Just quick, I think I just thinking three things. One is media ownership. For example, like the Fox case, the media ownership always matters, I think. And people have limited media literacy about the media ownership. And then that's why I think media consumers becoming pretty much biased, not just on the news, but on their own. That's why media ownership, we need to be very careful about that. And then the media capacity. The capacity is like the journalism organization, others, and the journalists, their passion is more on the ID, not on the profit. That's kind of the media capacity should be built through the code of conduct. And on the other hand is the consumer media literacy. It's always matter. I think here the disinformation and misinformation and the other consequences is being mostly opportunistic based on the media literacy, whether it is lack or it is fulfilled. That's why these three things we need to be serious, and that will answer some questions, not just for the relationship between the politicians and the media, but also with the general population.
What happens when we have a populist politician ruling countries that become very divisive? Then we get out the best and the worst in the artists and journalist communities, which means that everyone is forced to take sides. And what happens that, for example, a lot of the journalists now are really becoming very partisan towards Duterte, for example, or towards upholding larger people's interests, which has somehow been elided during the past administration. It has been taken for granted. So we also get the phenomenon of trolling on social media. If you post something that's unfavorable to the leadership, then you are trolled by the supporters. And a lot of the women journalists have been trolled and demonized and sexualized in their social media accounts. But there has to be a global aspect into this. So two of the women journalists who stood by their conviction recently, just this week, won very prestigious independence awards. One from the Reporters Without Borders, and another one from another kind of benchmark organization that somehow guarantees or somehow is also on the lookout for the best practices at this time of the rise of this populist leadership has become a kind of global phenomenon. So there has to be a kind of international dimension into it, a kind of rebuff to the local populist leadership that is evolving in various countries.
Yeah, and one of the aspects of this populist leadership, be it Trump, Duterte, Bolsonaro in Brazil, is to demonize the press and to say the press can't ask us questions. We don't want them to ask us difficult questions. And if you will indulge me, I would like to show a little over a minute clip from a press conference that Trump had 2 days ago. This is very new.
What kicked someone out? Who was it? Was it Patricia and Cortado, or who was it? Patricia? Cortado? No, but the who got the awards? It was Patricia. Or? It's not Cortado. What's her name?
They're hundreds of miles away, though. They're hundreds and hundreds of miles away. That's not an invasion.
Honestly, I think you should let me run the country. You run CNN.
All right.
And if you did it well, your ratings would be much better.
If I may ask
that's
one other
enough.
question, Mr. President, if I may ask
Peter,
one
go
other
ahead.
question, are you worried?
That's enough. That's
Mr.
enough.
President, I was going to ask one of the other folks.
That's
have had,
enough.
Pardon me, ma'am. Mr.
Excuse
President,
me. That's enough.
Mr. President, I had one other
Peter,
question,
let's
if
go.
I may ask, on the Russia investigation. Are you concerned that you may have
I'm not concerned
indictments-
about anything with
that you may
the
have
Russian
indictments coming down?
investigation because it's a hoax.
Are you-
That's enough. Put down the mic.
Mr. President, are you worried about indictments coming down in this investigation?
Mr. President.
I'll tell you what, CNN should be ashamed of itself having you working for them. You are a rude, terrible person. You shouldn't be working for CNN. Go ahead.
I think that's unfair.
You're a very rude person. The way you treat Sarah Huckabee is horrible. And the way you treat other people are horrible. You shouldn't treat people that way. Go ahead. Go ahead, Peter, go ahead.
In Jim's defense, I've traveled with him and watched him. He's a diligent reporter who busts his
Well, I'm
butt
not a
like
big
the rest
fan of
us.
yours either, so
I understand.
to be honest.
So let me ask you a question if I can. You repeatedly said...
You aren't the best.
Mr. President, you repeatedly, over the course of
Okay,
the...
just sit down, please. Well, when you report fake news, when you report fake news, which CNN does a lot, you are the enemy of the people.
So
They're hundreds of miles away, though. They're hundreds and hundreds of
You know
miles
what?
away. That's
I
not
think
an
you
invasion.
if the press asks difficult questions, he calls them the enemy of the people. In this case, this reporter from CNN is now barred from the White House. And yesterday, the White House announced that they're going to bar other reporters who ask difficult questions. So this is the new populism of demonizing the press.
Roland, can I ask you a question about, and also again kind of playing devil's advocate. There are the official numbers in the Tohang of how many were killed, and then there are the numbers that come from other sources. And if once the idea of fake news is launched, it's very perspectival, no? It's from one perspective, we're saying that the official numbers are essentially the fake news, and those on the other side would be saying that the numbers that are generated elsewhere are essentially the fake news. So how do we navigate this? How do we have faith in the numbers that we want to support in some sense, that uphold the position that we ourselves uphold? I think again of the collapsing in the early 80s. There was a famous story of a cultural center that was built in Manila by Imelda Marcos very quickly for an international event, and that cultural center collapsed during the construction and supposedly killed hundreds of workers, and they were buried in the construction, cemented over, and the cultural center was built with these bodies in the cultural center. But that story has been sort of rebuked for the past 3 or 4 decades, I guess now 3 decades. And yet it's a story that in some sense we cling to defend the position. So I guess what I'm asking is, how do we navigate these binary positions?
Well, the 23,000, nearly 23,000 killed came from the Philippine National Police. Before, they were understating it at 4,000, 3,000, etc. But somehow a number leaked out, and that is the number that is used to reckon with official statistics. What we are also trying to endeavor in the Philippines is to do more of a scientific-based kind of research. So a grant has been given to Ateneo School of Governance to be able to monitor the entire field of reports that have come out. And based on this, a number came out for the period that the project allowed it. The first year, there were 4,000, nearly 4,000 plus, that were reported on media, whether in different broadcast media, about the number of extrajudicial killings In other words, one can use really the numbers, but the archives do not also lie. The coverage, even though it's limited, is kind of emblematic or symptomatic of certain larger scopes of rendering the phenomenon of the war on drugs, the killings, visible and also invisible at the same time. It's a kind of fantastic phenomenon wherein bodies are dumped in very public places. The drive-by shootings are also done in very public places, some of them in very broad daylights. And based on the data found by the School of Governance, there's a kind of peak season, peak hour of killing in the country, taking place from 10 p.m. to 2 a.m., as reported in various medias. So in other words, the perpetrators of the extrajudicial killings also want to make the killings a kind of a way to surveil people, so that you don't become drug addicts, so that you don't make public this fascinate or a kind of promenading during the night phenomenon. So it's a very anti-poor statement. And what you said about Imelda, there is an archival footage that suddenly came out after the Marcoses were deposed in 1986, showing that there were actual bodies that victims were alive when the film center collapsed, because the following month was already the opening of the Manila International Film Festival of Imelda. And those archival footage do not also lie. I mean, they may not tell the entire truth, the numbers and the scope of the culture of impunity, but they also somehow tell us stories, alternative stories. And if you're in the humanities or in the social sciences, then gossips or political jokes are very important to us, because they also tell what is also not being told officially in the newspapers or in the broadsheets.
So we still have time for more questions. Oh, Theo, you want to?
Hi, thank you for wonderful presentations. I have two questions, so I'm going to read them back to back. They're kind of related, so you can choose which part of those. And sorry, just a moment. So I'll read them out. So throughout the history of journalism, there have been periods during which the news is not out there, but it concerns the act of reporting in journalism itself. I'm referring here to, for example, the arrest of the Reuters journalists that is all over world news right now. So the attention is suddenly on the journalists themselves and on behind the scenes of truth. Partially what they were going to report on, we already knew it was out there in the public. So all of a sudden, the journalists become the news, the inner workings of the journalism machine, and so this act of turning the lens not outwards but backwards towards onto the reporting machine, what does that symbolize? And my second question is, what does it mean when fiction takes over the act of revealing the truth? That seems to shift the focus from seems to shift the focus towards personal narratives of, let's say, the journalists themselves, their own trajectories, their families, and so on, and their professional lives. That takes the focus. Or the focus is on that rather than on the transparency of the political process, on the independence of media and media literacy of the judicial system, and the accountability of both state and corporate actors towards the public. So what are your thoughts? Do you see a conflict there, or does the creative representation of reality serve as a necessary function that reporting alone cannot fulfill?
Well, those two questions are quite related. When one is portraying anyone within a narrative film, in general, the drama and of someone as a personality tends to be built up much higher than it would in, say, a documentary film, right? So let's take, for example, All the President's Men, the film about Watergate. And a lot of it is about Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward, and just them as people. And from that, they became heroes. And Bob Woodward has written like endless books now. He's a hero as an author. His latest book is about Trump. But he become, and it's a very sensational book, right? And it's about Trump as a person, not so much as the politics of Trump. But that's something that's just a part of our kind of narrative structures in trying to tell a story. That's just how we do that. Now, to kind of take another angle on this, one of the things that we're seeing today in this kind of newer world where politicians argue with journalists and demonize journalists, we're seeing the politicians try to focus on journalists as individuals. So you have Trump going after Jake Tapper, and Trump going after the CNN reporter that he's banned. And he takes the names of people, and even though Trump is always criticizing CNN, in the clip I just showed, he's talking about how this reporter is a disgrace to CNN, but he hates CNN, right? So the kind of personalization today is to demonize the reporter because the reporter is the first line of asking a question, a difficult question to the politician. So our politicians demonize the reporters as people.
Well, I think, yeah, the more we have more advanced technology and overwhelming of the information, people started to become numb and very much disempathy towards what's happening, especially to the negative news, the bloodshed, the killing, and the number of the deaths may not hit them directly, their empathy anymore, because of the overwhelmingly this kind of negative news again and again. That's why I think that's why we prefer literature in sometimes. If it is not the propaganda style literature can dig enough to the humanity and the nature of the humankind. So with these two can support every individual to practice our freedom of opinion. That's why I think we do need both, and that's why we keep saying that we prefer to have right to information as a law, and right, if we have the kind of the freedom of expression and right to information, every single people can be strengthened by learning about the real information from the primary source, not from the processed source as a media. Most of the media is more or less processed, the primary data or primary information. So if we are encouraged and strengthened by the primary source of information, we can be more sort of analytical and wise enough to consume. That's kind of the explosion of the information, and then we also do need to be more human being from the literature, so then we can connect. That's how I consider it.
Okay. I think actually because our guests have to get out of here, we actually need to call this session to a halt. and we will come back at 2:30 for the next round of speakers, and there'll be more discussion after that session. So thanks so much for coming out this morning. Hope to see you this afternoon.